Hey everybody, welcome to Cats and Court TV. This is your girl, Miss Public Info, here with the latest and greatest and sometimes hated updates of the most high profile cases going on around the country. Okay, guys, so we're back with the Diddy of it all. And today, Judge Submaranian, or I should say late last night, Judge Submaranian actually docketed the judgment that he brought down on Sean Combs back on October 3rd. So he docketed the sentence, the 50-month sentence that culminates with 5 years supervised probation. And also, this docketed judgment also triggers the 14 days that the Combs defense team has to appeal this conviction. Okay, so let's talk about all of that. Let's get into that. And I am going to sort of give you a brief overview of what the judgment is, what it includes in this particular document as it relates to what the actual probation conditions are. And then we're going to look at this filing together and really sort of go line by line and sort of analyze what this all means for Sean Combs. Okay, so let us get into it. Now, he will be supervised for 5 years. So says the filing. Okay. He will be required to attend regular meetings with his probation officer and refrain from drug use with random drug testing. So there will be a drug test taken within 15 days after his release and two periodic tests after that time frame, likely random. This is normally how it goes. Now, he must participate in an outpatient program that includes testing, an outpatient mental health treatment program, and an approved program for domestic violence. This is according to the 7-page filing that we're going to go through in a second here. His probation officer will also be allowed to drop in on him unannounced at any time, and he must live at a location approved by the Department of Probation. He must submit to a search of himself as well as his properties, his residence, his vehicle, paperwork, computers, and cell phones, but only when there is reasonable suspicion that he has violated a condition of his release. Now, this also includes the fact that he cannot own, possess, or get access to a firearm, ammunition, or any destructive or dangerous device or weapon. He will be required to work at least 30 hours a week, and he is forbidden to communicate with anyone that has been involved in any criminal activity. Now, this is very normal, these particular guidelines, and we're going to go through the more specifics here in a second as we go through the document. But the overview I just gave is very, very normal for what folks who are under supervised probation go through after they complete their sentencing. This is fairly procedural, especially as it relates to not being allowed to have any sort of any deadly or dangerous devices or weapons or firearms, owning firearms. You can't own a firearm if you are a convicted felon, especially if you are a convicted felon that has a violence on the felony conviction, which this one is tied to that. So that is going to be something that Sean Combs will have to give up for life. Obviously, it's good that he has access to security who can protect him and things of that nature. So he doesn't necessarily have to own those firearms for himself, but it's something that he's going to have to refrain from. Also, one thing that was not included in this overview, but is normally included and probation requirements or conditions is being around other convicted felons. That's part of the condition, usually of probation, supervised probation, that you cannot be in the presence of or sort of communicating with or having any sort of activities with other felons. That's something you're not allowed to do. So we're going to go into this filing and take a closer look at that. And then we're also going to see which former inmate of Fort Dix actually offered Sean Combs some advice. So that's more to come there. Let's get into this filing and see exactly what is going on here. Let's go here. Let's get into this here. I hope you guys are doing well. It is Wednesday, the hump day. Thank goodness we are here and we made it. Okay, so I think, you guys might not be able to see that yet, but I think you can here. Let's take a look. Yes, you should be able to see that there. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's pause this. Let's take a look at this document here. I'm going to go through um, listing here. Here at the top is just very procedural, showing the counts in which he was found guilty of, which are counts 3 and 5, which are the transportation to engage in prostitution counts. And then, of course, they also name check the counts in which he was acquitted of, which were counts 1, the RICO, and then the 2 and 4, which were the SEX trafficking counts. And this was signed by Judge Submarine on yesterday. And then it gives the imprisonment time. It says 50 months that the defendant is hereby committed to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to be in prison for a total term of 50 months. And then it goes on. And it says that the court makes the following recommendation to the Bureau of Prisons. Of course, I went over this last week, but we will read it here as well. It says the court recommends that the defendant be incarcerated as close as possible to New York metropolitan area and recommends that the defendant be considered for admission to any available substance abuse program, including the Bureau of Prisons Residential Drug Abuse Program, otherwise known as RDAP, to which he qualifies. Now, I'll back up for those of you who didn't watch last week's episode and say that when Judge Submaranian made his assertion or response to the defense's request for the Fort Dix RDAP program, he said that he would not recommend the Fort Dix RDAP program specifically, but not because Sean Combs didn't qualify or any other kind of specific reason. He says, really, the reason why I won't recommend this specifically is because it is up to the Federal Bureau of Prisons where Sean Combs actually does his time. So he says, I will not, the court will not be recommending that on behalf of Sean Combs to the BOP, Bureau of Prisons, because it's just not our place to do. But what we will say is that we recommend that he be admitted into a residential drug abuse program for which he would qualify. Any program, RDAP program, and within the Bureau of Prisons that allows him in because he does qualify. Now, there are a little bit of misnomers about the fact that whether or not Sean Combs actually does qualify for this particular program, seemingly because this particular program at Fort Dix requires that its occupants or its participants rather don't have a violent history. And of course, Sean Combs on these 2 convictions, he has the sentence enhancer portion of these convictions that include violence, a propensity to violence, domestic violence, etc. So that sort of would preclude him from being involved in this program. But as we sort of look through the Bureau of Prisons, there are other RDAP programs or substance abuse programs within the Bureau of Prisons throughout, but it just may not be there at Fort Dix. So also, of course, he'll have to wait online to be accepted into these programs. There are many other inmates who are currently incarcerated in other places who are looking to be accepted into this program. So, of course, his automatic admittance into this program has its stipulations because there are people waiting online even before him. So we will have to stay tuned to see if he gets admitted into the Fort Dix program. But certainly the court has recommended that he does, that he is rather considered for admission to available substance abuse programs, including RDAP. So we will stay tuned on that. Now let's go further down. Now, here is where we're talking about the upon release from imprisonment, Sean Combs will be supervised release for a term of 5 years. And let's go through these conditions because these conditions are, there are standard conditions of supervision, which we're going to go through here, but then these are the mandatory conditions. And there's only one checked here that says that, listen, you've got to do this, but these other ones that are not checked does not apply to him, but definitely one, two, three, and five apply to Sean Combs. And so let's go through them just so you can see what all of this means for him. Now, mandatory conditions for Sean Combs. He must not commit another federal, state, or local crime. Two, he must not unlawfully possess a controlled substance, so no drugs for him. Three, he must refrain from any unlawful use of controlled substance, so possession or use, and he must submit to one drug test within 15 days of release from imprisonment and at least two periodic, meaning random, likely random, drug tests thereafter as determined by the court. Okay. Then the checked box for him, which would be number five. So you see under three, the subset of number three is not checked. So that means it is not applicable to Mr. Combs. Only thing in these checked boxes or these little boxes that would be applicable to Mr. Combs are the checked boxes. And there is only one, and it is number five, that he must cooperate in the collection of DNA as directed by the probation officer. So that's something that he is going to have to comply with. Now let's go down to here to the standard conditions of supervision, and there are 12. As part of Sean Combs' release, he must comply with the following standards of supervision. The conditions are imposed because they establish the basic expectations for his behavior while on supervision and identify the minimum tools needed by probation officers to keep them informed of Mr. Combs, to report to the court about Mr. Combs, and to bring about improvements in Mr. Combs' conduct and condition. Okay, so number one is Mr. Combs must report to the probation office in the federal jurisdiction or the federal judicial district where he is authorized to reside within 72 hours of his release from imprisonment, unless the probation officer instructs that he report to a different probation office or within a different time frame. Standard. Two, after initially reporting to the probation office, Mr. Combs will receive instructions from the court or the probation officer about how and when he must report to the probation officer, and he must report to the probation officer as instructed. Standard. Three, Mr. Combs must not knowingly leave the federal judicial district where he is authorized to reside without first getting permission from the court or the probation officer. So, of course, I probably don't need to explain this, but I will anyway. This, of course, is very standard, but essentially it's Sean Combs may not leave the state or the country or anywhere other than the place in which he's been registered. His place of residence has been registered with the Department of Probation as being where he will be at all times during the course of his 5-year supervised probation. If he wants to leave that judicial district for whatever the reason might be, it could be business, it could be personal, it could be whatever, he would have to get permission from the court or the Department of Probation, his probation officer, essentially. Okay. Number 4, Mr. Combs must truthfully answer the questions asked by his probation officer. Standard. 5, he must live at a place approved by the probation officer. If he plans to change where he lives or anything about his living arrangements, such as the people he lives with, for example, he must notify the probation officer at least 10 days before the change. And if notifying the probation officer in advance is not possible due to unanticipated circumstances, he must notify the probation officer within 72 hours of becoming aware of a change or expected change. Now, for Mr. Combs, this is not going to be a problem, but I would say by and large, in other situations where people don't have as many resources as Mr. Combs, this one seems to get people in a lot of trouble where, the place in which they were approved to stay and be under this supervised probation is no longer available. It could be a family member doesn't want them there any longer. It could be that their financial situation changes and they can't afford to be there anymore. And so this sometimes becomes a point of contention for people that have lower access to resources because they're not able to stay in that area. Like a lot of times when people come out of incarceration, they don't have any means, which is different for Mr. Combs. But so usually they're at the mercy of living with someone and sort of being that, at that particular address. And I've seen time and time again where people actually are released and they have this one address, and maybe sometimes months, 2 months, 3 months into their supervised probation period, they actually have issues maintaining residence at this particular home because they have issues with resources. Either they're not making enough for that person wants them out, or that person changes their mind about allowing that person to utilize that address as their residence during this period of probation supervision. So that's something to think about there. But just for your own edification and educational reasons, you might want to know about it. But for Mr. Combs, this is not going to be an issue for him, likely. Okay, moving on to number 6. You must allow the probation officer, Mr. Combs must allow the probation officer to visit him at any time at his home or elsewhere. And he must permit the probation officer to take any items prohibited by the conditions of his probation that the probation officer can see in plain view. So I'm going to stop here and hit a beat here because this says that the probation officer is allowed to visit Mr. Combs at any time, whether it's at his home or he could be at the studio or he could be at, a hotel within his, jurisdiction that the probation officer knew he was going to be in. Or he could be at anywhere. He could be at a dinner function. He could be at a business meeting. And Mr. Combs must allow that probation officer into that area, building, domicile, whatever, wherever he is. And he has to allow that probation officer to take any items, okay, that are prohibited by the condition. So, for instance, he could be in the studio doing work, but there could be people there, or it could be him. But let's just say there are people there that have drugs there, right? And it's in plain view. And Mr. Combs, according to the mandatory conditions that we read over, which was 1 and 2, mandatory conditions 1 and 2, he's not allowed to possess controlled substances, nor is he allowed to use controlled substances. So you're saying, well, if it's there and it's somebody else's and not his, then how did they know? Well, he's also, because he can't possess it, and if he's there with it, then he can't even be around it. This is what I'm talking about when I said previously that he's probably not going to be able to be around other felons because he can't communicate or interact with anyone that is a felon themselves because it actually heightens the propensity for Mr. Combs to actually violate some of these other standard or mandatory conditions of the supervision, which would include possessing a controlled substance or using a controlled substance. So Mr. Combs can't even be around it. If his probation officer were to come into uh, one of his studio sessions or perhaps a meeting or a photo shoot at a hotel or some other location that he was having, and there was something there in plain view. This standard condition number 6 said that the probation officer could actually take that. They could take those items in as evidence for them to say, Mr. Combs, you're prohibited to have this. We're going to take possession of this. We will talk to you further about what, if any, uh, you know, uh, ramifications there will be for you having this item. So again, this is where all of this comes into play in terms of not being able to be around these controlled substances, but also not being able to be around people who are felons themselves. Number 7, Mr. Combs must work a full-time job at least 30 hours per week at a lawful type of employment unless the probation officer excuses Mr. Combs from doing so. If he does not have full-time employment, he must try to find full-time employment unless the probation officer excuses him. If you plan to change where you work, if he does plan to change where he works, then he or anything about his work, such as his position or anything like that, or his responsibilities, then Mr. Combs has to notify the probation officer at least 10 days before the change take place. Very similar to the living circumstances. If notifying the officer at least 10 days in advance is not possible due to an unanticipated circumstance, then Mr. Combs would then have to notify the probation officer within 72 hours of becoming aware of a change or expected change. So this is likely not an issue for Mr. Combs. He owns several businesses. Obviously, he's self-employed. So, he has whatever his responsibilities are. He will make that known to the Department of Probation. They will then, confer with him on that. But number 7, again, much like number 5, is a very a big hang up for a lot of former felons who actually come out, of incarceration, and they have this supervised probation, because a lot of former felons have a tough time finding work. And so, people who will lawfully employ them not under the table. So this is not working at Jim Bob's, motor car company, or working at, the local mechanic shop where they're paying this guy under the table. No, this has to be lawful, above board. Has to be a place where, you receive a W-2 or W-4 or whatever the case is, and that the place is filing taxes on, um, what their salaries are paying out. So this is not a place in which, you can work under the table. And this is why a lot of former felons sort of get hung up and get actually revo, because they can't find jobs. Now, in this particular instance, the Department of Probation, they do have resources where the former felons can actually tap into the resources that the Department of Probation can provide to say, well, this is a place in which, actually employs former felons. So, you can go here or you can go there, or they'll give them, job career center resources that they can actually tap into to find, the listings where places, actually employ former felons. Of course, this will not be Sean Combs's issue, but I'm explaining this for those of you who just, want the education on this. This is a big hang up for a lot of former felons. And unfortunately, this one and the living issue, the living space issue, domicile issue, number 5, those are probably the main ones, besides fraternizing with other felons. Those are the main reasons why a lot of people rebo on these particular sentences. Revocation, I'm saying revo, and that's a Um, short term for revocation. That is when someone actually reoffends, or they, violate the conditions of their probation, supervised or unsupervised, like getting rearrested for a crime, or having police contact, for instance, that can get someone revoked. And then automatically, sometimes, depending on the judge, how they feel about the seriousness of it. Sometimes people will have to start back from square one. They have to start right on back I don't care if they've almost completed their probation of 5 years. Sometimes they'll have to go back to square one. They start the clock all over again to do another set of 5 years on the revocation. Or sometimes they have to actually serve out the remainder of their probation sentence incarcerated. So sometimes that's the punishment. Depends on how the judge feels and the severity of the crime involved. Okay. Number 8, Mr. Combs must not communicate or interact with someone he knows is engaged in criminal activity. If he knows someone has been convicted of a felony, he must not knowingly communicate or interact with that person without first getting the permission of the probation officer. Now, let's stop there. This is the one I've been talking about and sort of sparsing through these conditions as I go through and explain them. Now, this is a very standard condition, and for a lot of people, it's very hard. And it's because a lot of times, a lot of people who are, coming in from or coming out rather from being incarcerated, they normally socialize with other felons, especially people who are like, gang members or involved with people who are involved in the drug, game or cartels or anything like that. They normally have an issue keeping this because the key to either their social life or the key to, how they, provide for their families or themselves are basically based around other people who are also convicted felons. So for Sean Combs, what does that look like? Well, he's in the music industry. He's in entertainment. So Mr. Combs will definitely have to poll any new people that he surrounds himself with and make sure that these people are not former felons. Also, people that he knows to be former felons, if they are, and he has to work with them for whatever the reasons are, those people will have to be basically, vetted by his probation officer. Mr. Combs can say, oh, I'm working with XYZ rapper on this album, but XYZ rapper has a felony on his record. I wanted to speak with you all to make sure it's okay that I still work with XYZ rapper. And then it's up to the discretion of the probation officer, who obviously is going to go through the proper channels to find out if this in fact would be okay, especially if XYZ rapper is on probation himself. For instance, like if Sean Combs wanted to work with Young Thug, for example, who we know is on probation for the next 20 years, then it would have to be a thing where he would have to get express permission. Otherwise, it's a no-go. You can't do that. Also, as it relates to just, interacting, being in the presence of socializing, can't do that. So a lot of people get in. This is another one that gets a lot of people revote and sends a lot of people right back to, either incarceration or sends them right back to square one and starting that probation clock all over again. And sometimes they get a new sentence of probation if they revo. Let's just say, they revo on that, and then they have to do a whole year, and then they come out a whole year incarcerated, and then they come out, and then they have to still be on probation when they come out. So that is a real fact there. Okay, number 9. If Mr. Combs is arrested or questioned by a law enforcement officer, he must notify the probation officer within 72 hours. Now, this is what I mentioned previously when I talked about police contact. Part of this standard conditions of probation, you're not allowed to have police contact. Even if you are stopped, let's just say it's just a standard, stop because maybe your tail light is broken, or maybe, you have an expired tag or something like that. That is not allowed. And it's not saying that would send him back to jail or anything like that, but that's something he has to report to his probation officer. If he is arrested, his one phone call that he better make immediately is to his probation officer to let them know, look, I've been arrested for a suspicion of X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 blah. Wanted to let you know before, the call came in from the court that that's what's going on. Now, the reason why it's better for Sean Combs or anyone, an offender, someone under a probation, to actually call that in the court, notifies the Department of Probation is because it fares better for him as to what that punishment might look like, right? So it's better for the offender to call it in himself or to tell, himself like, I was questioned because of X, Y, and Z. I mean, literally the conditions of supervised probation is literally just like an adult who is out in the world. Yes, you're free, but you cannot do anything without express permission. It's like if I need to go to the bathroom, almost, I have to get permission from my probation officer. And that's the reason why, like, these things are just not great to get into in the first place. Number 10, you must not own, possess, or have any access to a firearm, ammunition, destructive device, or dangerous weapon. We went over that already, or anything that could cause bodily harm or injury or death to another person, such as nunchucks or tasers. Okay, so he's not allowed to have any of that. That's pretty standard. And obviously, part of the law is that former felons are not allowed to have or purchase firearms or possess firearms anyway. So that's a condition of probation, but it's also a condition of his probation because, or a condition of his record rather, because he has a violence on his record. Number 11, Mr. Combs must not act or make any agreement with a law enforcement agency to act as a confidential informant without first getting the permission of the court. So he can't become, a CI, for an example, unless he gets permission from the court through the Department of Probation. And lastly, Mr. Combs must follow the instructions of the Department of Probation and his probation officer related to the conditions of supervision. And that is pretty much it. There are special conditions of this. This is like repeating a lot of what I've said already. Let's see if there's anything new here. The probation officer or may conduct a search under his condition. This condition only when there is reasonable suspicion that you have violated a condition of your supervision or committed a new crime, and that the areas to be searched contain evidence of this violation of crime. The search must be conducted by the United States probation officer. So this is basically saying that Mr. Combs must submit to a search of himself, his property or residence, computers or papers. I talked about that previously. And then it goes down here to say, and it talks about like computers, devices, storage. But then down here it says that this is only done when there's reasonable suspicion that he's violated some sort of crime. But then if the probation officer actually visits Mr. Combs and there is something illegal that he's not supposed to have out in plain view, the probation officer could actually confiscate that. And then based on that confiscation, the probation officer could actually come back to Mr. Combs's residence with an actual with a reasonable suspicion actually to search based upon the fact that he had something there in plain view he wasn't supposed to have. So that actually could still, this what we're talking about here could actually happen on the heels of Mr. Combs actually having something out in plain view that the officer could see that gives the officer reasonable suspicion that he has violated a condition of the supervision, if that makes sense. And then it goes on to just say failure to submit to a search may be grounds for revocation. So, of course, as I explained to you, revocation means that you basically violated the conditions of the probation. Uh, this could, yeah, this search could be grounds for revocation of the release, and you must warn any other occupants, meaning of his home or anywhere that he may be, that the premises may be subject to searches pursuant to this condition. You must not have contact with the victims in this case. Mr. Combs may not have contact with Ms. Ventura or Miss Daphne Joy, who is Jane Doe. This includes any physical, visual, written, or telephonic contact with persons. Additionally, he must not directly cause or encourage anyone else to have contact with those victims, which we know is kind of like the Sean Combs special. That especially was something he was doing when he was incarcerated at the MDC. So he's not going to be able to do that, or he's expressly a forbidden from doing that. Okay, so then he goes on and he says he must provide the probation officer with access to any requested financial information. He must not incur new credit charges or open any additional lines of credit without approval of the probation officer unless he is in compliance with the installment payment schedule. Um, so for instance, in this particular case, we have a forfeiture and then we have a fine. Mr. Combs is probably already satisfied that. But until Mr. Combs satisfies the forfeiture and the fine that's connected to this, the forfeiture was in and of itself the items that he forfeited, that they saw or confiscated during the search, related to the two counts that he was convicted of. The fine was, I believe, around $500,000. So that in itself, once that is taken care of, then this particular portion will not pertain to him. But until that is taken care of, Mr. Combs may not incur new credit charges or open additional lines of credit without approval of his probation officer. Mr. Combs will participate in an outpatient treatment program approved by the United States Probation Office, which program may include testing to determine whether he has reverted to using drugs or alcohol. He must contribute to the cost of the services rendered based on his ability to pay, the availability of third-party payments. The court authorizes the release of available drug treatment, evaluations, and reports, including the presence or the pre-sentence investigation report to the substance use disorder treatment provider. So anyone that is going to be treating Mr. Combs, outpatient facility that would be treating Mr. Combs would have uh, would have ownership, or they would have possession rather of the pre-sentencing report that came through, or the pre-sentencing investigation report that came through from the Department of Probation. They would also have any other treatment evaluations, anything that he may have, courses or trainings that he may have had there in jail, or treatments that he may have had there in jail at the MDC, and any other reports. Those would be in possession of the substance outpatient program as well. Then they also went on to say that this program has been approved by the Department of Probation, which may include drug testing. This program that he's under, they may actually include random drug testing, and this would be to determine whether or not Mr. Combs has reverted back to using drugs or alcohol, and that Mr. Combs will be financially responsible to the cost of these services, to pay for the third party payments to actually enact this drug testing that he must participate in. It goes on to say that he must participate in an outpatient mental health treatment program approved by the U.S. Department of Probation, and that he must continue to take any prescribed medications unless otherwise instructed by the healthcare provider. Now, this is going to be interesting because I did a whole episode on the fact that Sean Combs is likely bipolar. It came out within the early portions of the trial court phase of the case, and then we didn't hear any more about it. It was likely something Sean Combs did not want to be made public, so much so that even when he was begging for the court's mercy, that he didn't even mention this as a potential issue, which actually could have worked in his favor to grant him a little bit of leniency as it relates to the sentencing. But it is a very interesting point, because I wonder now, the judge I'm sorry, the court rather did, sentence as part of the sentencing. Mr. Combs has to participate in outpatient mental health services. And so I wonder with this, is part of that going to be for the bipolar treatment? Is he going to be under medication, for that? We don't know. We don't know if Mr. Combs is seeking any treatment for this potential, bipolar diagnosis. But certainly, if he were to be seeking treatment for that, he would have to take the medications. And that's something that I've come to know within working in the legal field and working within law enforcement, that a lot of people who are under the order of the court to take, for instance, bipolar treatment medication, lithium, and other kinds of bipolar medications, they often don't do it because they complain that it makes them feel weird, makes them feel just numb. They don't feel anything. It sort of, dumbs down their creativity. It doesn't allow them to be their full self. And so a lot of times people get in trouble with the court when they're under these sorts of mental health treatment outpatient, guidelines, because the court will be able to observe through the reports from their probation officer that their actual behavior indicates that they are not actually taking their medication. And that's how some people get in trouble with the court for not taking their medication, because their behavior is showing that they're not. And then, it's a snowball into reverting back to drugs and alcohol, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all connected. The court goes on to say that they authorize the release of any psychological or psychiatric evaluations and reports, including the pre-sentence investigation report, to that health care provider, and that Mr. Combs must participate in an approved program for domestic violence. And it is also recommended that he be supervised by the district of his residence. So the monetary penalties, again, like I said, the fine is $500,000. And then he has an assessment penalty here for $200. And that doesn't apply to him. These don't apply to him. And then, of course, the check down here is the forfeiture. This is the forfeiture I mentioned earlier, where he forfeited, items, property that they compensated during the time in which they were searching. That only applied to the counts in which he was convicted of, which were the prostitution counts. So that, guys, is a 7-page document that we sort of went through. If you're still with me. Don't forget to subscribe and like also if you're still with me. But I just wanted to break that down for you to tell you that is exactly what that document says. And these are the conditions in which Sean Combs will have to abide by once he is released into the Department of Probation's custody, essentially, for a period of 5 years. Now, who is this person that is giving Sean Combs advice on how to make it in the Fort Dix prison? Well, you may remember that last week I told you that none other than Juicy Joe Jedice, he actually spent time there in Fort Dix. Now, Juicy Joe, he did not participate in the RDAP program, but he did do his stay in the Fort Dix prison. And he, of course, was, I believe he was convicted of a fraud, bribery, I think tax evasion. He had a whole litany of things going on there. Of course, he served, I believe he served a period of 3 years there at Fort Dix. But let's talk about some of the advice that I call him Juicy Joe because that was his nickname on the Housewives of New Jersey. Joe Giudice is his real name, but of course, people who are familiar with the actual show would recognize his nickname, Juicy Joe. Now, he actually gave his advice or his warnings rather to Sean Combs through his own attorney, James Leonard Jr., through an interview that he did with Fox News that I thought was very interesting. But here's what he had to say. He said, some people would say it is a pretty easy place to do time. He said, number one, they live in a certain area inside the prison with other people that are in the program, right? So you're not in the general population. And what he's referring to here is he's referring to the RDAP program. He says, so you're not in the general population. You're in a different housing area and other participants in the program, all of whom have been carefully screened, all of whom have been legally and clinically eligible. Additionally, this could help Sean Combs get a shorter sentence. He says, so those 12 months would have him ultimately released in February 2027, give or take. And in the event that he successfully completed the program, he received a maximum of 12 months off. But he said, not everyone gets in. And this is what I spoke about earlier when I said there are already people online. He has to wait to get in before those people. Now, Juicy Joe, his lawyer says that Juicy Joe served his sentence in the general pop, and he was not part of the RDAP program, as I explained earlier. He explains that it's not exactly easy to get into the program, even if you are actually placed at Fort Dix to do your time. And quote, he says, you don't just walk into the program, okay? There's a wait list, right? There's other people. This is very desired, he says, not only for the help that it provides, not only for the benefits of the living conditions, which are different than the others, but at the end of this, you get time off of your sentence, he says, so you have to behave. He also gave him a clear warning. He says if Diddy goes to Fort Dix, there's a chance that he may not get into the special program, the RDAP program, and instead he may actually serve his sentence in general pop, like Joe Giudice. And if that turns out to be the case, Giudice has offered some warnings to Sean Combs. Giudice told Fox News that he witnessed violence and gang activity during his time at Fort Dix. And he said that there was one time he even saw a knife attack. He says that they stabbed someone, and quote, he says, they just like stabbed each other as they're walking across the track. It's like you've barely even seen anything, but they just like stabbed each other for whatever reason, whatever it was. So obviously there is, some violence there at Fort Dix. I mean, I've heard that it's kind of like the Club Med of these, the BOP. But Joe Giudice is telling a very different story. And of course, Joe's attorney was absolutely right. And he's echoed everything in part in which I've said about Sean Combs's opportunity to get into this program, or the reality that he could get into the program, is that you could actually be sentenced there. Sentenced there to serve your sentence there, but it doesn't automatically mean you're going to get into that RDAP program, because it is such a popular program that people want to get into. So it's still, the jury is out on whether or not Sean Combs will get into the RDAP program. It's very likely that he may end up doing his time at Fort Dix, which, even though, as Joe Giudice plainly told us, there's violence there that he witnessed, and that he witnessed gang activity and drugs and all of that. It's still a low security prison. It's still relatively more safe than other prisons within the BOP system. And so, he would still be in a better spot. So because the judge has said, like, recommended that, hey, Sean Combs should be as close to the New York metropolitan area as possible. Obviously, he's using his residence there as a point to say, I need to be close to this area. Then, they may place him there. In New Jersey, this part, the northern New Jersey, where Fort Dix is located, covers the New York metropolitan area, for those of you who may not be familiar. And so they may place him there. But as Joe and Joe's attorney said, him being placed there does not actually, increase his chances of positively being entered or registered into the RDAP program there at Fort Dix. Also, something to note is that just because Sean Combs has utilized New York metropolitan area as his residence for his stay while he is incarcerated because he wants to be close to this area, does not mean that once he is released that he has to also stay within the New York metropolitan area. He could very well go and, to his home in Miami at Two Star Island, and that area would be the area in which he would be reporting to a probation officer out there, or it could be in, anywhere for that matter that he considers his residence. All right, guys, that's going to be it for Casting Court TV for today. This has been your girl, Miss Public Info, with the latest and greatest and sometimes hated updates of the most high profile cases going on around the country. I appreciate you guys rocking with me today. We will be back tomorrow with more. And until then, stay safe, stay out of trouble, guys, and we will see you soon. Peace.